Our speaker is Fan Yang from University of Chicago, USA. Today, she presents her talk on the topic, Love Doesn't Run Out. Children and adults do not view love as zero-sum.
Hello, welcome to my presentation. I'm Fan Yang, a research faculty from the University of Chicago. It is my pleasure to present our work on children's and adults' zero-sum thinking about love and other social resources. The work was led by my previous PhD student, Kevin Wei, from the University of Chicago. Well, love is perhaps the warmest thing we can experience in the world. When we think of love, we often think about the deep human connections and human relations and bonds, like those shared between siblings. While those warm relationships and moments do exist, they are not always present. In fact, between siblings, it often looks like this. As captured by the concept of sibling rivalry, siblings actually often compete for their parents' time and attention, sometimes asking questions like, "Who is your favorite child?" In other words, they behave as though love is zero-sum. One person's gain is another's loss. So the question is, do they really think love is zero-sum? To explore this question, we told children and adults some very simple stories. So for example, we told them there is this child who is Anne, and this is her mom. Anne has love from her mom, which means her mom really cares about her. And then we introduced another character into the story. We said, this child is adopted to Anne's family, and so this child also has her mom's love. So now let's compare what Anne has now with what she had before. So do you think Anne now has less love from her mom compared to before, or does she have the same amount of love as before? If children and adults think love is zero-sum, they may predict that they may say that Anne now has less love than before, because now this new child also gets love from the mom. So we told them stories about love, but also about other types of resources. So for example, we told them stories about love and trust, which we think are basically non-rivalry. So one person gets it not necessarily affects another person gets it. We also told them about other types of social resources, such as leadership and popularity, which we think might be more rivalry because of their relative status among individuals and the nature of social comparison for these resources. In other words, if everyone is popular or everyone is a leader, then basically the concepts lose its original meaning. So that's why we think these might be more rivalry and thus more zero-sum compared to love and trust. As a comparison, we also told them stories about material resources. Some material resources are rivalry, like candies and stickers. If someone uses the same sticker or eats the same candy, then the other person cannot do it. Whereas we also tell them stories about other non-rivalry kind of material resources, such as air and music, so that we could compare how children's thinking about social resources compared to their thinking about material resources. So these are what we got from adults. So the y-axis shows the percentage of adults who actually think the resource is zero-sum. So for the non-rivalry resources, for the social ones, basically love and trust, we found that very few adults actually think these are zero-sum, only maybe about 10% also, just like the non-rivalry material resources such as air and music. In contrast, they think the rivalry social resources such as leadership and popularity as more zero-sum than love and trust, but still as less zero-sum than rival material resources such as stickers and candies. And we found the similar patterns among both older children, basically the 7 to 9-year-olds, and younger children, the 4 to 6-year-olds. If anything, what we found is children are actually has less of a zero-sum thinking compared to younger children, has less zero-sum thinking compared to older children and adults. So these findings suggest that there seems to be a sharp difference between social resources and material resources, such that in general, social resources, both revelry and non-revelry types, are less zero-sum than material resources. So study 2, we want to explore the mechanism underlying this type of thinking, the difference between social versus material resources. One hypothesis is that perhaps people just think social resources and material resources as fundamentally different. There are some like inherent qualities for social resources that make them look like less zero-sum compared to material resources. However, there is a competing hypothesis, which we term it as the renewability hypothesis. So basically, it says social resources are not fundamentally different from material resources. The only difference, the major difference perhaps is only that social resources are more renewable than material resources. Because if we want to create more social resources, we actually could do so at will. Whereas for material resources, it actually takes actual time, energy, and resources to create. So in other words, we could make social resources more or less zero-sum based on how renewable it is. And similarly, we can do so with the material resources. So to test these hypotheses, we assigned children and adults to one of 3 conditions. In the baseline condition, basically we wanted to conceptually replicate what we had in study 1. Besides, we also asked them to indicate how renewable they think each type of resource is. In addition, in the other 2 conditions, we emphasized that either the resources are renewable or non-renewable. So we wanted to see whether this renewability information could affect people's judgment of how zero-sum the resource is. So these are the major results we got for adults for the default baseline condition. So basically, in terms of their zero-sum thinking, we replicated the findings in study 1. So adults, they think love is much less zero-sum than leadership, and leadership was less zero-sum than sticker. And in terms of renewability, we saw the reverse pattern. They thought most adults think love is renewable, more renewable than leadership, and sticker is basically not renewable. And we found very similar patterns again with older children and younger children, except that the patterns seems less pronounced in younger children, but it gets like more differentiated as children grow older. Moreover, we also use their judgment of renewability to predict their zero-sum beliefs, and we found that the more likely they view the resource as a renewable, then the less likely they think the resource is a zero-sum, which supports the prediction of the renewability hypothesis. So these provide some kind of correlational evidence in support of the renewability hypothesis. But we want to see if renewability has some causal effect. Therefore, we did the renewability manipulation in these 2 conditions. In the renewable condition, again, we told children stories involving a main character, and we say this child, for example, David, gets love from his mom, which means his mom really cares about him. These are the same from in study 1. But except that for this condition, we added this 1-sentence simple manipulation in which we emphasized his mom has a big heart, so if another child also needs love right now, she is able to create more love all by herself. Then we introduce this new character. Look, the child in the red shirt is adopted by David's family and also gets love from the same mom. And then we ask the same question as before. So compared to what David had before, do you think he has the same amount of love as before, or does he have less amount of love now? So that was the renewable condition. The non-renewable condition was very similar, except that we just emphasized, well, the mom doesn't have unlimited time and attention, so even if she wants to create more love, she could not do so for another child. So these are the major effects we found for adults. As we could see from the graph, so adults in the renewable condition thought love and leadership and sticker were all non-zero sum, whereas adults in the non-renewable condition, they were much more likely to think these resources as zero sum, which provides causal evidence for the renewability hypothesis. We also found very similar effects among older children and younger children, except that the results seem to be weaker among younger children. But it's mostly driven by the fact that younger children were more reluctant to admit the resources as zero sum, even in the non-renewable condition. So really seems like young children, they actually start by thinking of resources as non-zero sum instead of zero sum. Of course, we also want to point out that while there was an effect of renewability, it doesn't mean like the differences between social and material resources got completely eliminated. As we could see in the non-renewable condition, like there is still a pattern, like people tend to view material resources like a sticker as more zero sum than social resources like leadership and love. But at least the evidence supports the conclusion that these effects are not solely driven by the inherent properties among social versus material resources, but the renewability of these resources actually account for much of the variance. Well, I guess no one wants to live in a world where one person's gain of love is another person's loss. And it would be far better to live in a world where love is renewable and non-zero sum. So the good news is that, as our findings show, both children and adults' beliefs about love really align with this vision. And it's not just the love, this actually applies to other types of material and social resources as well. So our work shows that recognizing the renewability of resources can reduce zero-sum thinking, helping us create a world where everyone can thrive together rather than at the expense of one another. Well, I would like to thank our dear colleagues for their input on this project, as well as the wonderful research assistants from my lab, the Human Nature and Potentials Lab at the University of Chicago. Our paper has been published this year at the journal SPPS. And if you are interested in learning more about our lab's work, you can go to our lab's website, which has information about our published projects. Thank you very much for your time and attention.